It's not 1,000,000 degrees out, because it's usually, I've never given an anniversary tour out here where it hasn't been at least 95 degrees, so I am thankful for this today. I know many of you who are here this morning, you know me, but for those of you who don't, I'm Jonathan Noyalas. I am a history professor at Shenandoah University and director of the university's McCormick Civil War Institute. Before we begin the tour this morning, and we spend about the next hour and a half together, I want to just make a couple of announcements. So when the tour is over, feel free to come inside, cool down. It's a little bit humid. We have some cookies and those types of things that my wife has made, so I thank her for that. We also will have at noon historian John Tracy. We'll be speaking about Colonel Thoburn, and we'll spend a lot of time with Colonel Thoburn on our tour this morning. And then at 1 o'clock is the official celebration and launch of my book. Some of you have already bought it. That's great. So if you're sticking around for that, you are certainly welcome to do that. We have all kind of things inside for you to look at. Phil Spoggy is here. Where is Phil? Phil Spoggy is here with a collection of arms relevant to the Battle of Cool Spring. We have our exhibitions inside, artwork of Paul Salmon. So there's plenty to do to kind of fill your time in between the gaps over changing programs. One of the things that I will say before we head out is that everything that is interpreted at this site, the visitor guides that we give everyone for free, all the interpretation is all funded through private donations, like from people like you. So this is my PBS moment. There is no regular budget for the Civil War Institute to do what we do out here. So I'm very appreciative. So many of you have contributed over the years. If you'd like to contribute, there is a donation jar inside. Any amount is very much appreciated. Now, if you want to donate like $1 million, we'll name something after you. So this could be the Casey Turbine Lodge. I'm just saying, Casey, if you have an extra $1 million lying around. But we are all very appreciative of that. This really is an outdoor classroom for my students at Shenandoah University in history. It teaches them how to do history. So a lot of what you see out here, exhibition-wise, trails, my students have worked on, these various things with me. If you have questions throughout the course of the tour, please don't hesitate to ask. For those of you who might get tired as we're walking along on the paths, we have cavalry backup. My wife will be driving a golf cart. So if you need that amenity, it's there. We can't fit, everybody on there, obviously, but we will. So, all right, follow me. All right, so I want to set the stage for the tour this morning, talking about the varied reactions to Jubal Early's his advance toward the gates of Washington on July the 11th. So Jubal Early, for a month prior to July 11th, 1864, he was tasked by Confederate General Robert E. Lee to use the Shenandoah Valley to create a strategic diversion, which of course, as if you're a Civil War person, this is exactly what Stonewall Jackson had done in the spring of 1862, to create a strategic diversion to alleviate pressure on Petersburg and therefore the Confederate capital in Richmond. So Jubal Early's men, they moved from Petersburg to Lynchburg. They drove a Union force commanded by David Hunter out of Lynchburg. They moved north through the Shenandoah Valley into Maryland, fought at the Battle of Monocacy just outside of Frederick on July the 9th. And then 2 days later, they were on the northern boundary of Washington with Fort Stevens standing right in their path. As Jubal Early was in front of Fort Stevens, he could see in that very hot, dry weather. So weather conditions, people always ask on a Civil War tour, what was the weather like? It was well above 100 with the heat index and extremely, extremely dry. It had not rained for 3.5–4 weeks. So Early's men had marched almost 500 miles by that point. They were hot, they were exhausted, they were worn out, And just as they get to the northern boundary of Washington, they could see dust clouds behind the Capitol. And of course, what they're seeing are Union reinforcements from the 6th Corps coming there to help bolster the defenses of the National Capital. So Jubal Early ultimately makes the decision to not attack. As Early's army left the northern periphery of the Capitol on the night of July 12th, he had a conversation with one of his staff officers, Major Henry Kyd Douglas. And Douglas recorded this in his post-war memoirs. It's now a very famous exchange for Valley historians. And Jubal Early turned to Henry Kyd Douglas and tried to give him an assessment of what the march to the gates of Washington actually meant. And he said, "We haven't taken Washington, but we've scared Abe Lincoln like hell." Now, people can have their reactions, and they can believe what they want to believe, and then there's reality. The reality of the situation is, if you look at the writings of Lincoln's private secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolay, members of his cabinet, and others who knew Lincoln and who were very close to him in mid-July of 1864, Lincoln was not scared at all. In fact, I would argue that Lincoln was one of the very few federal officials who was not freaking out when Confederates showed up on the outskirts of Washington. Lincoln had every bit of confidence in the defenses of that city. He had every ounce of confidence that the Confederates would not be able to punch through, and even if they did, what would they be able to achieve? They don't have any reinforcements. They're not going to be able to sustain any success. If Lincoln felt any emotion on July 12th, 1864, it was aggravation. Because as Jubal Early's army was leaving Washington, heading ultimately back to the Shenandoah Valley, President Lincoln wanted Jubal Early followed and pursued immediately. He wanted him destroyed. But there was a problem. There was not one single commander responsible for the defense of Washington. There were all these various different departments and different commands. It was very fragmented. And so President Lincoln knew that if there was going to be a successful pursuit of Early and Early was going to be destroyed, the first thing you had to do was appoint a commander. Now, Lincoln as president, he is indeed the commander-in-chief. But Lincoln made a promise in March of 1864 to Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, right after he appointed Grant General-in-Chief of all United States forces. He said, "I will never interfere in the operations of the Army unless you delay things significantly." So when Grant became aware of what had happened, he appointed Horatio Wright, commander of the 6th Corps. He put him in charge of that force that was defending Washington, and ultimately with a force that will grow to about 30,000 men, Horatio Wright was tasked with pursuing Jubal Early, following him, and annihilating him to make certain that the Confederate threat to Washington was once and for all eliminated. Now, Jubal Early gets a head start. So he's leaving Washington on the night of the 12th. Horatio Wright's force doesn't begin the pursuit until July 13th at 3 p.m. So it's not quite a 24-hour head start, but it is a significant advantage. Now, as Early's men are moving, crossing the Potomac near Leesburg and eventually making their way through Snicker's Gap, which cuts right through the Blue Ridge where Route 7, of course, brings you down to the Shenandoah. As Early's men are making their way toward Snicker's Gap, they all are having these varied reactions to what they had just been through. And again, in life, in history, people very rarely have a singular reaction to anything. And so there were soldiers in Early's army who felt like he did. That our march to Washington, it scared Lincoln like hell. There were others in his army who thought it was a waste of time. All he did was exhaust his men. There were others who thought that they could have taken Washington and they could have ended the war for in favor of the Confederacy. There were others who thought, well, we could take Washington, but then how are we going to be able to hold on to it? So you have all of these different opinions, but there was one thing that all of these men were in agreement about. They were exhausted. They were tired. When you think about the heat wave we've had here in the Shenandoah Valley, how many of you just love to spend, you know, aside from my son, who's a little strange, how many of you like to spend 10 to 12 hours outside just doing a lot of hard physical labor if you don't have to, right? Okay, so imagine these guys have already marched 500 miles, now they're moving back into the Shenandoah Valley, they are exhausted, and they want one thing, and that is rest. Unfortunately for them, President Lincoln is not going to give them the chance for rest. So what ends up happening is July 17th, right at Snickers Gap, you have the lead elements of Horatio Wright's force is going to come through that gap. It's going to be a cavalry division commanded by Brigadier General Alfred Dufay, supported by a brigade of infantry commanded by Colonel James Mulligan. So we have some people here today who are part of Kernstown Battlefield Association. They'll be doing some commemorative events there next weekend. And of course, that's where ultimately Colonel Mulligan will meet his fate. So throughout the day on the 17th, Dufay and Mulligan were trying to drive the Confederates from Castleman's Ferry. So where the bridge crosses the Shenandoah River today, that is essentially the area of Castleman's Ferry that was defended by Confederates commanded by General John B. Gordon. So they were unable all throughout that day to break that position. The following morning, they were unable. About 9 o'clock that morning, General George Crook, who was commanding troops from the Army of West Virginia, he shows up in Snickers Gap. He looks at that failed attempt of the 22nd Pennsylvania Cavalry, and he realizes that this is insane. I mean, we just keep doing the same thing over and over again, and it gets the same result. So let's try something different. So he met with Horatio Wright atop the gap, and he said, why don't we take a part of my command, about 5,000 troops, place them under the command of Colonel Joseph Thoburn, and march them through paths in the mountain, bring them across this property. So this property is known as the Retreat. So the Retreat during the time of the Civil War was a plantation about 1,100 acres owned by Judge Richard Parker. This is the same Judge Parker who presided over that man's trial, John Brown, in the autumn of 1859. Judge Parker is not out here at the time of the battle. His primary residence is in Winchester. So the idea was have Thoburn come through those paths, cross the Retreat, move across the Shenandoah River, which eventually we will get to, and then turn south and flank the Confederate position. Now, Thoburn thought this was a good, sound idea. Wright thought it was great. Crook thought it was great. But there was a problem. Thoburn didn't know how to get from Snickers Gap to here, to this road that runs right in front of the retreat known as Parker's Ford Road. So to help him get to that point, he is going to have an individual who spent a lot of years living in Castleman's Ferry guide through those pathways to this point to get across the river. Now I want to move up on the road here a little bit. We'll talk about that individual who gets them from point A to point B. But before we head up, do y'all have any questions for me? Okay, excellent.
20 years old, spry, wiry.
So, as I mentioned at the kiosk, Colonel Thoburn doesn't know where he's going. And so ultimately, the individual who's going to guide him is someone who had lived at Castleman's Ferry since the 1830s. His name was John Carrian. So John Carrian has, to me, just a fascinating story. And if you want to learn more about him, you can buy my book after the tour. So I'll give you enough, but not all the information. So John Carrian was born in 1818 in New York City. His family ended up coming to Clark County in the 1830s, which at that time it was still part of Frederick County. And he worked as a tailor. Now, when the Civil War broke out, the day after the Virginia Secession Convention voted to sever its bonds with the United States, John Carrian enlisted as a musician in the 2nd Virginia Infantry, a Confederate unit that would ultimately become part of the famed Stonewall Brigade. John Carrian stayed in that 2nd Virginia until March 11th, 1862, the date that Stonewall Jackson evacuated Winchester as Nathaniel P. Banks was moving south toward the city from Harper's Ferry. So, what ultimately compels John Carrian on March 11, 1862 to desert is unclear. All right, he leaves no written record. He actually has a very sad story to the end of his life. He came back to the Valley, came back to Clark County after the Civil War, continued to work as a tailor, but in 1888 ended up committing suicide. Where he's buried, we have no idea, because suicide was looked at very differently in the 1880s than it is today. So people wanted to basically forget that he ever existed, hence why it's difficult to figure out his story. But what we do know about Carrian is that after he deserted, he ended up going north to Maryland. And in January of 1864, he enlisted and became the chief musician in a Union regiment, the 3rd Maryland Potomac Home Brigade. So why does he do this? So we don't have his voice, so we don't know, but we can speculate what are potential reasons. One of the things that might have compelled him to do this is that he actually might have been a pro-Union man all along. But when the Civil War broke out, living as he did in this part of the Shenandoah Valley, which was ardently pro-Confederate, he thought, if I don't enlist, I could be putting myself, my life at risk, because people are going to want to know, okay, why aren't you doing anything to support the Confederate cause? But when Jackson leaves, he saw that as his out. Another possible reason is that he just became disenchanted with the Confederate cause early in the war. Maybe he had a change of heart, didn't believe in what the Confederacy was fighting for. Whatever the reason, John Carrian became one of 38,000 men from the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, to wear Union uniforms. This is not West Virginia. I'm talking about what is the Commonwealth of Virginia today. So John Carrian, as the chief musician of the 3rd Maryland Potomac Home Brigade, he is part of Horatio Wright's 6th Corps. He's part of that pursuit force. And ultimately, he ends up making himself available to Colonel Thoburn to serve as a guide. He knows this area quite well. So if you're standing at this spot on July 18th, 1864, around 3 o'clock that afternoon, you would have seen coming down this road in column of fours, this is a wartime road, you would have seen those 5,000 troops commanded by Colonel Thoburn marching down this road and heading toward the Shenandoah River. Now, Colonel Thoburn believed, based on all of the reports that he had received, that he would march to the river. This would be a very easy, uncontested crossing, but as you'll see when we get down to the river, that's not really the case at all. So now, I'll take questions if you have them, and then after that, we're going to do an about face and start making our way down to Island Ford. Questions?
Was there a concentration of Virginians who tended to serve with the Union? Was it more northern or western?
So that's a great question. So for those of you who didn't hear, the question was basically, was there a particular geographic area in Virginia where more pro-Union men came from? It's all over. And so, sometimes people don't realize this, but, every single state that was part of the Confederacy had a pro-Union population of at least 10%, including South Carolina.
Especially South Carolina.
And so...
Is that today or back then?
Back then. So, when you look at this, you have to remember some of these guys and their families are transplanted Northerners. Some of them are pro-Union because of their religious beliefs. Again, not everyone is monolithic in their thinking about what's right and what ultimately should be done. That's why history is so fun, right? Any other questions? Yeah, Blake?
Was Judge Parker actually here when this was going on?
So Judge Parker, he inherited this house when his father died in the 1840s. He was not here. But he does have an overseer who is here. And a number of years ago, I was able to track down just the tiniest little excerpt from the overseer's diary. His last name was Robinson. And he doesn't write a lot about the movements in the battle, but he writes about the aftermath of the battle. Because he sent a note back to Judge Parker in Winchester, and the note basically said, the plantation is trashed. I mean, it's just totally, totally trashed because of what happened. Anything else?
So, can you describe the landscape during that time?
Yeah. So, if you haven't been here before, but you've been on a golf course before, you might notice that some of the contours of the landscape mimic that of a golf course. That's because there was a golf course here for many, many years, built on a floodplain. Probably not the best thing to do, but the overall contours of the landscape, we had a cultural landscape study done about a decade ago. And the overall contours of the landscape haven't changed all that significantly, remarkably. But this is all pretty much corn and wheat that's being farmed on this property. So these guys are coming through cornfields, wheat fields, as they...
He had the property on the other side as well?
No.
That was not his?
No. So there are two islands that sit in the river. During the time of the Civil War, they were actually part of the retreat. Today, they're owned by the abbey that's on the other side of the river.
Also, in regards to the island, what we're looking at now really wasn't the case as to how it looked during the battle, because I think my conversation with you was that it wasn't as grown up as it is now.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, this side of the river was much more heavily wooded at the time of the battle, particularly as you get closer to Route 7. That side, not so much so. And one of the things that Confederates were doing on the 17th, because they couldn't see the Union soldiers as they were descending down the mountain, so they actually were taking their artillery shells and shooting them high into the trees to break them off and splinter the trees and use the trees as shrapnel. So there are accounts of guys being wounded and impaled with, tree limbs and those types of things. Anything else? All right, so I'm going to get out in front. And
This is new, actually, right?
Yep. 195 acres total.
Both sides, just this one.
Just this side, yeah. I wish we owned that side.
We will accelerate the Abrams Creek.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and... The lead brigade in Colonel Thoburn's division was commanded by Colonel George Wells of Massachusetts. So Colonel George Wells, again, he is fully expecting deploy skirmishers, come down here to the river, and we'll just cross. Now, that side of the river there was some brush, but it was not heavily wooded like it is today. But there was enough of brush to provide cover for Confederates from two Virginia regiments, from the 42nd and 50th Virginia, about 100 and 150 men total, commanded by Major Jesse Richardson. So when Wells's command gets to this point, those Virginians, they open fire. Obviously, they're taken aback by this, but Wells is going to deploy his men to basically 2 points. So he's going to send some of his troops down that way. He's going to send some of his troops this way. They're going to actually cross at 2 points and drive those Confederates from the opposite shore. So again, if you're talking about a brigade, so a brigade under Wells in 1864 has about 1,000 men. So you have 10-to-1 odds. Odds are clearly in your favor. It doesn't take long for those Confederates to retreat from that position. Now, during the fight, Wells's command captured about 16 men. So the numbers vary. Thoburn even isn't clear. Sometimes he says it's 12, sometimes it's 16. The number really doesn't matter. What matters is the information that Colonel Thoburn is able to get from those prisoners of war. What those POWs reveal to Colonel Thoburn is that Gabriel Wharton's division is about a mile away in that direction. John B. Gordon, of course, is a mile in that direction at Castleman's Ferry, and in that direction, about a mile and a half away, is Robert Rhodes' division. So as he receives this information, Colonel Thoburn is deeply, deeply concerned because he knows that if he stays there and doesn't have proper support, he has 5,000 men, Early has about maybe 9,000 to 10,000 men available. There's a river between him and the rest of the Union force, and Thoburn is very, very uneasy about his position. So he sends a message back up to General Crook and Horatio Wright, letting him know about this, and asks, can we recross the river to the eastern side, and let's come up with an alternative to get at the Confederates. So Crook and Wright, both of them say, nope, continue to cross your men, but don't turn south. So they're going to alter the plan a little bit. So cross your men here at Island Ford. So the ford actually goes right at the tip of this island. So there are two islands. This is Island Ford, or Parker's Island South, and then Parker's Island is north, and we'll see that at our next stop. So the ford technically actually skirts right this way, just over the tip of the island, but in July of 1864, hasn't rained in a month, it's been extremely hot, the river is as low today as it was back in the day. So you could cross anywhere. By the accounts I've read, water doesn't come up much past mid-thigh. So Thoburn isn't happy that he has to cross, but he again has to obey orders. So he crosses his men, and of course as he's crossing, he is thinking, his men are thinking, that this is going to be a cakewalk. But one of the things that this crossing reminds us is that soldiers on both sides had multiple enemies. So Union soldiers have Confederates as their enemy and vice versa. Disease is an enemy, but Mother Nature is an enemy. So as the soldiers are crossing the river here, there was a private in the 170th Ohio. His name was John Goundy. John Goundy, as he's crossing, gets his foot stuck in something. He called it a snag. And it was, when I say stuck, I mean stuck. To the point where it took several of his comrades to yank on his leg and dislodge it. Well, in the process of dislodging his leg, they ruptured his groin. Infection set in. He ended up being discharged in September because of that wound. He ended up dying in October because of that wound. The pension that his widow Anne filed with the federal government, and we'll talk more about pensions as we go along here in the tour this morning, it noted specifically the cause of his death as him rupturing his groin out here on the afternoon of July 18th. There are so many accounts that I've come across of Mother Nature, the environment, just wreaking havoc on these guys. This individual right here, Colonel Elijah Massey, was the commander of the 2nd Maryland Eastern Shore, part of Thoburn's command. He was 61 years old at the time of the Battle of Cool Spring. He was suffering from kidney disease and bladder disease. But yet, this guy who was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, he wanted to be with his men. He wanted to take part in that pursuit of Early's army out of Washington. After the battle was over, he survives the battle. He survives the bullets, but he can't survive the environment. He actually wrote a letter to Colonel Thoburn asking to be relieved from command, relieved from his commission, because the march from D.C. and crossing the river, he said, it did me in. And he was granted that release from his military service. So it takes about an hour for Colonel Thoburn to get his men across. They cross, and Thoburn is going to put his men in 3 lines. So he's going to have a line hugging the banks of the Shenandoah River. There's going to be another line about 75 yards up, and you can't see it now, but the ground slopes up. So very similar to what we have here, it slopes up, it's even more pronounced. About 75 yards up from the river, there is a crest. He puts a line of soldiers along that crest, and then a line of skirmishers ahead of that. So as his men are getting into position, there are all sorts of reactions going on among Thoburn and his commanders, as well as soldiers all the way down to the rank of private. There are some soldiers who don't have a really good feeling about what's going to happen to them. Surgeon John Noggle, who was a surgeon in a provisional brigade, we'll talk more about that brigade when we move on to our next stop, commanded by Colonel Samuel Young, he thought that battle was imminent. He thought we're probably going to lose. So he actually gathered the surgeons together in his command to think about, okay, when all hell starts breaking loose and it becomes clear that we're going to be pushed off this field, do we retreat or do we stay to take care of the wounded? And the surgeons were actually divided on this. Noggle wanted to just leave because he said, I don't want to be captured. I don't want to go to a POW camp. Of course, by this point in the war, medical officers would be paroled so that they could take care of the wounded, so he wouldn't have a typical POW experience. But other surgeons said, yeah, but if we turn around and retreat, we run the risk of getting shot in the back. There are other soldiers, like Colonel Thoburn, who are becoming increasingly nervous as you get close to 5 o'clock. As Thoburn's anxiety is going up, so is General Crook's, because Crook is much closer to the gap. He can look out into the distance, and Horatio Wright is with him. They look out into the distance, and they see Gabriel Wharton's division moving toward Island Ford. They see Robert Rhodes' division moving toward Island Ford. And it was at this point in time that George Crook begged and pleaded with Horatio Wright. He said, you must allow Thoburn to come back to this side of the river. He's cut off. Horatio Wright said, no, we're going to leave him where he's at, but we're going to send him support. And that support's going to come in the form of General James Rickett's division from the 6th Corps. So Crook, for the moment, was calmed. He will not be calm for very long, and we'll pick up that story at the next stop. Thoburn thought, okay, it's good, we're going to have, numerical parity. Well, shortly after 5 o'clock, Gabriel Wharton's division, right on the opposite bank from us, is going to attack the southern end of Thoburn's line. So right on that opposite shore are soldiers from the 5th New York Heavy Artillery. So they are going to feel the weight of this first Confederate attack. But it doesn't take Thoburn long to realize, and John Tracy is going to give a great talk about Thoburn and his abilities as a commander and all that wonderful stuff about him at noon. But Colonel Thoburn was a very, very smart individual. He understood early on into this engagement what Jubal Early's ultimate plan was. It wasn't just to launch repeated frontal assaults. It was to distract Thoburn with a frontal assault and instead launch a flank attack with Rhodes' division against the northern end of his line. So the Battle of Cool Spring, as it begins to develop that evening, so again, this is an evening and night battle. So as this battle begins to develop, Colonel Thoburn, recognizing the threat to that part of his line, he is going to start shuffling troops from down here to up there. Now he's going to always leave enough down here to deal with Wharton, but the major intense focus is going to be that far northern end of the line, and we're going to begin making our way down toward that spot in a moment. But questions?
Where is Parker's Hole?
We will be going to Parker's Hole, so stay tuned. Yes.
Questions. One, the Confederate Union, the fake attack, if you will, is that a 1-to-1, 1-to-2? How many troops were the Union putting forward to feign an attack, to feign a frontal attack?
You mean once Wharton starts to attack?
Yeah.
So Wharton, he is going to have about 4,000 guys.
Against 5,000?
Well, it's 5,000 total.
In this area?
So this area right here, these are troops from Colonel Wells's command, so you're looking at 1,000 men.
So you're looking at 4-to-1 odds?
Yes.
4-1 odds gives the Confederates a victory right there. So why didn't they not then pursue it?
Oh, we're going to talk about it. This is a very messy engagement that veterans will fight about for decades after.
That's a winnable situation.
Right.
Number two,
Monday morning quarter.
to get on the other side,
Yeah.
get on the other side, is there a way to get on the other, I mean, can you go down Route 7 and walk up, or is there private land? I mean, can you see what the
So,
side of the river's like?
so the opposite side of the river is owned by a closed order Catholic Cistercian abbey.
Okay.
So you are not permitted. You can go to the abbey. There's a gift shop there, and you can view from the gift shop the Cool Spring Mansion, which is where the battle gets its name from, because there was a cool spring behind the house. But there are no trails leading down to the river. So you can get to a point where you can. So there is on the abbey property, there's what's called a retreat house. You can go to that parking lot. You can kind of peer and view down, but there's no paths that lead down to the river.
But if they were giving you permission, then you could go down the river.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
Was the New York heavy artillery fighting as infantry?
They were. Yes. Any other questions?
Can you fly fish down here?
Sure.
I like
He wants to feed the army.
All right, we're gonna head up out of here and. All right, so we have moved north, so we're getting close to the far north end of Thoburn's line. So if you look right through the trees here, you can just see the southern tip of Parker's Island. And so as we walk along, you'll get some really good glimpses of it. We'll actually end our tour where I'm going to share a story about a very, very tragic episode that happened there after the battle. But once Thoburn realizes that Wharton's attack is not the main attraction but the main distraction, and that the main attraction is the flank attack up here from Rhodes' division, he starts shuffling those troops. But it's still going to take time. And so you're going to have to rely upon those soldiers who are on that far north end of the line in order to fend off Rhodes' attack long enough. Well, the problem that Thoburn confronts is that the soldiers guarding the far right end of his command are from a very hodgepodge unit of dismounted cavalry. So Colonel Samuel Young commanded what was called a provisional brigade, had 1,000 men, came from 27 different cavalry regiments. So a few weeks before the Battle of Cool Spring, all of these guys from all of these different cavalry regiments were pulled together, put into this force, and they were told, you are going to fight as infantry. So for those of you who are, aficionados of Gettysburg, and I say the term dismounted cavalry, you're thinking John Buford's guys out there with, Sharp's carbines and all that kind of stuff. No. When I say dismounted cavalry here at Cool Spring, I mean guys who don't have a horse, guys who have been told by the government, you're going to trade in your carbine and we're going to give you a musket. And we're not going to give you a whole lot of time to train as infantry, but we're going to send you out to fight. So Young's Provisional Brigade, they're the far north end of his line. When Rhodes attacks, so again, battle starts shortly after 5 o'clock, flank attacks probably happening the first assault around 5:20. So by most accounts, Rhodes' men hit that flank, Young's command, they fire a volley, and then the large majority of them retreat. Now, years ago, they retreat across to this side of the river. So you're talking 1,000 men for the most part. There are some guys who stay and fight, but for the most part, 95, 96% of those 1,000 men, 25 minutes after the battle begins, are back over here. They're like, we've had enough. Now, Casey Turbin, who's over here, interviewed me a couple days ago for his podcast addressing Winchester. So if you don't listen to that podcast, I recommend you do because it's wonderful. But we were talking about different things related to the battle. And I had always thought, years ago when the university acquired the property, this 195 acres, I made an assumption, which historians can't do, but sometimes we're flawed and we make assumptions. You think that if guys fire a shot and just retreat, that they are what? That they're cowards. Well, it turns out the more you start to dig and read, this is a product of their lack of training. So one of the guys who was part of this provisional brigade is this guy right here, Sergeant James Henry Avery of the 5th Michigan Cavalry. So Sergeant Avery, this is a post-war photograph of him, by the way. So Sergeant Avery, when he sees Rhodes' men, he's all excited. He loads his musket, but he makes a major, major mistake. He takes the cartridge. So for those of you who don't know, a musket cartridge has the bullet and the powder all wrapped in paper. He takes that and doesn't separate the powder from the bullet and instead rams the whole thing down. The paper's not combustible. So he goes to shoot it, click, nothing happens. So he's like, uh-oh, this is a problem. So fortunately for him, one of his buddies ends up getting shot, picks up that musket, remembers how to load it, loads it, shoots it, but then he left his ramrod up against a tree and didn't have any way to load another shot. So he basically said, the heck with this, I'm done, I'm retreating. So in a matter of less than a half an hour, Colonel Thoburn loses 20% of his command. Just like that. They're on this side of the river. So now he's down to 4,000 men, whereas you have well over 8,000 Confederates on that side of the river. Just as Young's command is starting to come across, General Crook and General Ricketts get to this general area right here, because Ricketts was promised to cross and provide support to Thoburn. So Crook wants to get Ricketts across as soon as possible, and they're trying to find a suitable crossing point, and General Ricketts sees all of Colonel Young's command coming to this side of the river. So Ricketts says, yeah, you know what, we're not going to cross over to this side of the river, or we're not going to cross over and support Thoburn, we're going to stay here. So Crook is beside himself. He said, I can't believe this. The general commanding the pursuit force says this is what you're supposed to do, and he said, not going to do it. So there's an argument that takes place. So Crook and Ricketts go back up closer to Snickers Gap. They're talking with Horatio Wright, and Horatio Wright says, you know what? After thinking about it, I think Ricketts should stay here, that he should not cross, because there's nothing to be gained. It's already a losing effort. Well, this is something that the guys who are in Thoburn's command are never ever going to forgive Ricketts and Horatio Wright for. They will fight about this in regimental histories and memoirs and the pages of the National Tribune until their death, saying that if we were properly supported, we could have in fact won the Battle of Cool Spring. So what ends up happening, Cool Spring, the measure of success is different. The measure of success now is survival. So Thoburn is thinking, what do I do? So again, he starts shuffling those troops. He's going to take another of his brigades, so kind of opposite of where we're at right now, Colonel Daniel Frost, and he's going to have them wheel north to present a front to the attacking Confederates. Problem is, as Frost was moving his men into position, Confederate bullet rips through his bowels, mortally wounds him. He's taken off the field. As he's taken off of the field, his men are looking around, they're concerned, and the bulk of Frost's command, they retreat. So there's another 1,000 guys that are moving to this side of the river. So Thoburn now has about 3,000 troops on that side. But he still is determined to stay and fight, because what he decides and what those who remain decide, it is much riskier to retreat now while there's daylight out than if we wait until darkness. If we can hold out until dark and we'll get the cover of darkness, we'll have a better chance of survival. Now, as those troops are shuffling north, there is going to be support that comes in the form of 2 Union artillery batteries. Batteries C and G of the 1st Rhode Island. So they're going to set up in the bluffs, in the mountain. And we'll talk more about the artillery 2 stops from now. But I just want to make you aware that there is some support, but it's not going to be in the form of infantry. Now, as Young's command is retreating, as soldiers from Frost's command are retreating, there are going to be challenges that they confront. And we're going to move down toward Parker's Hole. We're going to talk about the challenges that Mother Nature provides, as well as the frightening experience of soldiers thinking that they're being shot at with explosive bullets. Questions?
I got one.
Yes.
So question number one, why did the Union take away the carbines and replace them with muskets? It's still a weapon? Were they expected were those carbines going then to another, mounted cavalry? Why remove a firepower, which they're familiar with, as opposed to a musket, which is inefficient?
So, great question. Logic sometimes doesn't reveal itself. They wanted them to fight as true infantry. I agree with you. I don't get it.
It's a cavalry weapon. They're not going to fight as cavalry. You're going to be fighting as infantry.
And with all due respect, sir, I can kill you as easily and more effectively with my carbine than a musket.
Sure.
Yeah.
And how many carbines are there?
Well, and the other issue is one of ammunition, right? So if these guys are armed with Sharps and Spencers and Smiths, it's different ordnance. So it's a lot easier for them.
Okay.
Load up the .58 caliber, and we're good to go.
Number two, you have a commander that's taken out, shot in the bow. Where was his second? I mean, usually in a military situation, your second say, "Hey, we're sorry, but we're going to continue." Why did the second not continue?
He's coming this way. They're done. So by most accounts, when Colonel Frost goes down, his men in an instant are retreating. So it's pandemonium, panic. All of Frost's subordinates are not able to get things under control.
There's no
control.
No other. His second in command is not with him.
No, they are panicky just as much as everyone else.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, I think what's really impacting these guys is they're waiting for the support. They can see the support over here. It's not coming, and so this is clearly a game of survival for them.
So are we talking about maybe 15 minutes to a half hour between Young's command retreating, the attempted wheel, and then that didn't even make it out of the...
That's correct.
And so all of a sudden, okay, so maybe a half hour.
Half hour tops.
Yeah.
And these guys are streaming here. And again, all these fields, you have Ricketts Division is watching this. And one of the things that happens, even though Ricketts' men aren't engaged, they're still suffering casualties. Because once the artillery opens up in the bluffs, Confederate artillery from the opposite shore is firing over. The shells are landing short, and they're landing in the midst of Ricketts' command. So it's just it's a cluster, to put it mildly.
Areas further up?
Yes.
Okay.
Typical Civil War battle.
Yeah.
Then from start to finish, how long was the Battle of Cool Spring?
So they start crossing about 8:30, 9 o'clock, so about 4 hours. But there's going to be artillery firing through the night, and then skirmish. We'll talk about that at our last stop. Anything else? Okay.
Fridays.
No.
I've been there long enough.
Okay.
It's not happening.
All right. So
History.
one of the points on the Shenandoah River that is oftentimes written about, it's storied. People want to know where it is. Parker's Hole. It is right there. So you can see how the water is kind of swirling a little bit. So Parker's Hole presents a challenge to Union soldiers who are retreating across from the west side to the east side. So if you think about this for a moment. So if you are from Colonel Young's Provisional Command, you forded the Shenandoah River at Island Ford around 3:30, 4 o'clock. The water came up maybe mid-thigh. So once you've made that decision to retreat, you're thinking, okay, I run across, I come over Parker's Island, which is right here, and I just continue on my merry way to safety. You're not expecting to plunge into 25 to 30 feet of water.
An unpleasant surprise.
Very unpleasant surprise. So there are four Union soldiers, whose cause of death at Cool Spring is being drowned in that body of water right there. For individuals like Surgeon John Noggle, the one I mentioned earlier, he was lucky enough to skirt Parker's Hole. He didn't know where he was going. But when he got to this side, he wrote about how horrifying it was to see guys that he knew, guys that he cared for, plunging into Parker's Hole, screaming, fighting for their life, and just being taken over by the water. He said that this haunted him for his remaining years on this earth. So what happens here is going to haunt these guys on both sides for the rest of their lives. Now, even if you did not plunge into Parker's Hole, the Shenandoah River still poses a challenge for you if you're suffering from a wound. So these two brothers right here, James Smith and Samuel Smith, right, these two guys fought in the 18th Connecticut Infantry. So they are part of Frost Command that is coming across here after Frost goes down. Now, a lot of soldiers in Frost Brigade swore up and down that as they were retreating from the battlefield, that the Confederates were shooting explosive bullets at them. And if you know anything about Civil War ammunition, there actually were explosive bullets used during the war. There was a Gardner patent shell made out of pewter that had a little fulminated mercury filament in the back that would ignite after it went out the musket, and it would blow apart in tiny little pieces. Or there was Shaler's sectional patent bullet, which was basically 3 lead cones stacked one on top of the other. Now, in the lodge, in the exhibition area, we actually have Confederate Gardner bullets, not Gardner with an I, but Gardner with an E, taken from the battlefield that were defective. They actually blew apart. So Confederate Gardner bullets made out of lead were notorious for having air pockets in the lead. And if you shoot a lead bullet that has air pockets within it, it will actually give the effect of an explosive bullet. Now, as these guys were retreating across the river, there was a bullet, or a fragment of a bullet, that ended up in James Smith's back. He makes it across, he struggles, he gets to somewhere in this point, but the pain from that wound is just staggering. He loses all of his strength, he falls face down in the river and starts floating away. His brother Samuel has a decision to make. As all this chaos and pandemonium is going on, do I try to save my brother who's being taken away by the river, or try to save myself and not make my wife a widow and my kids fatherless? He decides to let his brother go. His brother ends up drowning. He's pulled out by a local farmer about 2 or 3 miles from here, buried along the banks of the river. But Samuel, when the war is over in the spring of 1865, actually comes back, finds his remains remarkably, and brings them back to the family cemetery in East Killingly, Connecticut. So again, Mother Nature is posing challenges, the chaos of the battlefield is posing challenges, but for the Confederates there are challenges as well. They're not having to cross the river, but they're having to deal with Union artillery in the bluffs. Those 2 Rhode Island batteries that are eventually going to be supported by Battery E, 1st West Virginia Artillery. When we get up to our next stop, I'm going to talk more about the impact of that artillery fire and share a very, very sad and tragic story with you. So those of you who know me and who have been on battlefield tours with me know that I can be a killjoy at times. That I'm not bringing you out here to tell you a great story and to make you laugh.
War sucks, man.
War sucks. It's tragic. And I want people to always be reminded of that in case you have forgotten. Any questions?
For the right price.
All right. Okay. One of the things that has always amazed me about the Battle of Cool Spring is the reaction of soldiers in Robert Rhodes' division. So if you think about the engagements in which Robert Rhodes' division has been involved by the summer of 1864, they have seen it and done it all. They're regarded as one of the best divisions, arguably, in the entire Army of Northern Virginia. A lot of Rhodes' men write that of all the battles they had been involved in, this was, and I'm quoting now, the most sharp and obstinate affair. It's remarkable. Now, one of the things that makes this such a very sharp and obstinate affair is not only the doggedness and the tenacity of Thoburn's men who are doing everything they can to repel, multiple assaults. There's at least 4 or 5 assaults that Rhodes' men are going to make against the right end of Thoburn's line. But what also makes it a sharp and obstinate affair is the artillery. So we're not going up this path that is like this, all right, because I'm nice, I want to spare you a little bit. But in those bluffs, you're going to have, by the late evening, those 3 artillery batteries I mentioned, Battery C and G, 1st Rhode Island, and Battery E, 1st West Virginia.
And how many guns are in a battery?
So there are actually a total of 20 guns up there.
Okay.
So the distance from the top of the bluffs across the river, and again, all this is open and clear. You had a very clear line of sight. The distance from the top of the bluffs to Rhodes' line is about 500 yards. The Union artillery was wreaking havoc on Rhodes' command. A lot of the casualties that are suffered in Rhodes' division are coming from the Union guns in the mountain. One of those guys who ends up becoming a casualty is this guy right here, Sergeant Aaron Leonidas DeArmond. He served in the 30th North Carolina. Sergeant DeArmond had a piece of artillery shrapnel tear through one of his legs, injured him pretty severely. People didn't think he was going to even make it off the battlefield. But once the battle was over, he was taken off, eventually sent to Charlottesville, and then on to Richmond to the General Hospital. And his wound was healing. And the doctors in early August said, okay, you're good enough now, you're done fighting for the duration, but you're good enough now to go home. So Sergeant DeArmond lived just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. As he was making his way home, he started to feel really bad. Now, whether he had an infection or whatever, we don't know. There's no account of this, and you'll see why here in a moment. He gets within a few miles of his house just outside of Charlotte. This is August the 19th, so a month and a day after the battle. And he's just, I'm so exhausted, I'm so tired. He ends up going into a nearby chicken coop. I'm just gonna take a nap. He never woke up from that nap. He died just a few miles from that home. There are other soldiers in Rhodes' command who are going to be injured in one of those multiple assaults. One of them was a young lieutenant from the 43rd North Carolina. His name was William Bevins. So this right here is William Bevins. And I want to just share his story briefly. We have some more stuff in the lodge related to this. But Billy Bevins' story, to me, is a reminder of the great pain and suffering. So you come onto a Civil War battlefield tour, and we talk a lot about death and tragedy and destruction and all those types of things. But maybe sometimes we can't process what that actually means. So this is a page from Billy Bevins' diary, dated July 18th, 1864. And I remember reading this years ago because I could see pain and suffering on paper. So if you look at his diary, right here he starts out, riding from the division camps, which was actually near Wycliffe Church, about 1.5 miles from here. And the writing is all nice and neat and on a straight line. And then you notice down here, it's all over the place. Writing is almost illegible at some points. He's pressing really hard. This is the point in time where he's writing about the wound that he received at Cool Spring. This is where he's writing about getting his leg amputated without anesthesia. This is where he's writing about his journey from the battlefield to Winchester. Billy Bevins ends up dying about a week after the battle from this wound. What's remarkable about this is that his cousin and good friend, this guy right here, Captain Carey Whitaker, after the battle was over, was actually jealous of his wound. Because he thought, yeah, he might have lost a part of his body, but at least he's out of the Army. He can go home. He can return to civilian life. Well, Billy Bevins doesn't make it. And by the way, Captain Carrian Whitaker dies. He's wounded at Petersburg, dies in Danville just days before the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Now, when night descends over the battlefield, so you have to remember daylight savings time doesn't yet exist. So sunset, is going to come shortly after 8 p.m. So they come across, and all throughout this area, you have the soldiers of General Ricketts' division interacting with those soldiers from Thoburn's command. And they're saying, my God, you saw us over there struggling. Why don't you come and help us? The rank and file said we wanted to, but the generals wouldn't allow it. So speculation began to, start coursing throughout the camps that evening. And these soldiers in Thoburn's command are wondering, why does General Wright not make Ricketts cross? Well, in the absence of information, people's imaginations start to run wild. Yep. And so what ends up happening is there are some guys in Thoburn's command who think that Horatio Wright did this intentionally, that he wanted Thoburn's men to be cut up because he didn't like George Crook. And I think there is some merit to him not liking George Crook. The other part, I don't know. But he and Crook did not get along at all, and the fighting in the Shenandoah Valley in the autumn of 1864 really bears out that point. The veterans in Thoburn's command, they are going to fight about this battle, as I said, down at Parker's Hole for the rest of their lives. They will swear up and down that if we were supported as we were promised, we would have won the engagement at Cool Spring, but they did not. So there was still a lot of great uncertainty on that night of the 18th. What's going to happen next? Is the battle going to continue? Are we going to push across? Well, we're going to move down this path, heading toward the lodge a little bit. We'll stop. We'll kind of bring this all to a conclusion, and then we'll head back to the lodge in preparation for John's presentation at noon. Questions?
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
I went back to my comments. It's a 4-to-1 ratio, Confederates to Union. They're attacking this. Why were they not successful on that frontal attack? Why was it, if you will, stopped? Because that would give you...
Because of the artillery.
That artillery was the equalizer?
Yes. Yep. Yep.
So classic what if. What if Ricketts had support?
I tend to agree with Thoburn's command. You're going to have numerical parity. Thoburn's men, when they're in line along the river, they have the cover of a stone wall. So if you add that cover, you add the artillery, there's no reason to think that they couldn't, achieve success here. Anything else?
But then what? Assuming they cross the river, then what? They try to challenge early.
Yeah, and well,
engagement?
hopefully, Wright would have sent all 30,000 troops across and annihilated them as Lincoln wanted.
Yeah.
But he didn't.
So then, when this battle is over, does it really then just continue to retreat south?
Oh, no, I'm going to save that for the next stop. I like to keep you in suspense.
Thank you.
As Zach, and Casey and Sarah, who are here, will attest, that's how I always end a class. Like, with a suspenseful moment, I want to make sure you come back for the next class. That's right.
Classes I never skip.
Next episode.
That's right. All right. So, when the battle ended that night, this whole area was full of troops from Ricketts and Thoburn's command, and eventually they'll make their way back up toward Snicker's Gap. But on that night of the 18th into the following morning, this whole area along the river was picketed by the 2nd Rhode Island and the 37th Massachusetts. All of these guys were armed with Spencer repeating rifles. So as they are lining the riverbank right here, they could hear things from the opposite shore. They could hear the cries and groans of wounded. They could hear splashing in the water as wounded Union soldiers were trying to get across. So the job for these two regiments down here is to help those wounded get across to this side of the river. And whether that's by, laying a cover fire or actually getting out into the river and dragging them across. These moments where those soldiers from Rhode Island and Massachusetts are saving the wounded soldiers, this is something that actually inspired many, many years after the war a poet. Her name was Edith Thomas, and this is Edith Thomas right here. Comes from the great state of Ohio. So Edith Thomas wrote a poem entitled A Christopher of the Shenandoah, Island Ford, July 18th, 1864. And this poem was inspired by these stories of getting these guys, these wounded, back across the river. I actually have copies of this poem in the lodge if you're so inclined. This is a poem that most people don't know today. I didn't know about it until a few years ago when I uncovered it. But this was a poem in the late 1890s, early part of the 20th century that was regularly recited at Memorial Day ceremonies and other functions where veterans were being honored as an exemplar of American patriotism and not leaving your brother behind on the battlefield. Now, that following day, the 19th, there is some firing that happens, artillery, and some along the skirmish line here, but no real significant action. Later that day, Jubal Early receives word that another Union force, about 2,500 men, he didn't know the size at the time, but that Jubal Early's force, or excuse me, William Averell's force, was coming from Martinsburg south to Winchester. When Early learned about this, he knew he had to get out from this area, because if he stayed where he was, he'd be sandwiched between two Union forces. So he pulls his men out late on the 19th toward Winchester and then south toward Strasburg. It's that following day that Horatio Wright now crosses the entire army, all 30,000 troops, across to the other side of the Shenandoah River. What they see on that side of the river, it shocks and appalls them. Union soldiers half buried, hands, arms, legs sticking out of the ground. Other soldiers not buried but stripped naked and their bodies defiled in some way. There are various accounts of Union soldiers who see their friends, their comrades in arms, people they grew up with, and said, after seeing this sight, I now have a new motivation to fight this war. It's no longer just about Union and emancipation, now it's about revenge. Now, as those Confederates are leaving and heading toward Winchester and south to Strasburg, Horatio Wright sent a part of his command toward Berryville to just see where Jubal Early was. And ultimately, he didn't see Early, so he made the conclusion that Early was leaving the valley to go to Petersburg to reinforce Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. That's not what Early was doing. If he would have just pushed a little further west, he would have realized that Early was still very much committed to maintaining his presence in the Shenandoah Valley. But Horatio Wright sends word back to Washington, Early's done, he's left, I've achieved my objective. I've cleared the valley of Confederates, Washington, D.C. is secure. Events will later prove. Battle of Rutherford's Farm on July 20th. While Wright's thinking everything's good, it's not good. There's a battle fought north of Winchester, Battle of Rutherford's Farm. It turns out to be a Union victory. But then 4 days later, Second Battle of Kernstown. 6 days after that, John McCausland's Confederate cavalry rides north and burns Chambersburg. When you get into that period of 12 days after the Battle of Cool Spring, people in Washington, D.C. are thinking, okay, Wright's pursuit was a failure. Because Early is still in the valley, Washington is still threatened, it achieved nothing. Assistant Secretary of War Charles Dana, he wrote, and I am quoting now from his diary, Wright's pursuit did nothing, end quote. I have oftentimes felt that it's because of sentiment like this that the Battle of Cool Spring doesn't receive the attention it deserves. Because there are no significant strategic gains, there are no significant political outcomes. But as a historian, a battle's value is measured in multiple ways. And as a historian of this battle who's been researching and writing about this for a long time now, more than a decade, This battle's importance comes from its multifarious impacts on human beings. Individuals like Marianne Terry, whose husband, Sergeant John Terry of the 123rd Ohio, died on Parker's Island at some point between the night of the 18th and the morning of the 20th. Marianne Terry, who I write about on this sign here, this is her claim for a widow's pension. She didn't care tactically what happened, politically what happened, strategically what occurred. This battle made her a widow. It made her 2 sons, Joseph and Lycurgus, fatherless. On the opposite side of things, for Confederates, individuals like John Alexander Stikelether, who was the color bearer of the 4th North Carolina, this guy right here, he really didn't care that Cool Spring was another Confederate victory. Something happened at this battle that haunted him for the rest of his life. During one of those assaults of Rhodes' division, his 2 best friends, Martin Snow and Sidney Bustle, each one on one side, one on the other, were killed instantly. He knew as the color bearer he was the target, but he didn't take the bullet, his best friends did. That haunted him for the rest of his earthly life. He writes about this extensively in his post-war memoirs about how he is haunted by this, the psychological trauma of what occurred here. That's why this battle matters. That's why we remember this battle on the 160th anniversary, and that's why this battle, in his words, not mine, was a battle that deserved never to be forgotten. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming out this morning and participating in the tour. I know I got long-winded, but it happens. I'll give you a reason. So if there's any questions, I'll take them. Any closing questions?
Jim, do you have anything?